This house is alive, and it has chosen its next victim. Mark was holding an old key he had found in the attic, and its metallic coldness made the man shiver. The key looked as if it had been there for decades, yet it remained surprisingly strong. The feeling of anxiety he had when he first looked at the key only grew stronger as he approached the closed door. The door looked ordinary, worn wood, an old lock with a light coating of rust. As Mark inserted the key into the lock, he heard a dull click, and the door slowly opened. Inside was an empty room, 4 bare walls, a wooden floor, a little dust in the corners. Nothing that could explain why the room was locked. The room seemed unremarkable, but the air in it was cold, despite the warm weather. Mark looked around, feeling heavy in his chest, but saw nothing strange. They closed the door and decided to forget about her. The next morning, however, the door was open. Mark remembered for sure that they had locked it, but now the lock was unlocked and the door stood ajar. The room remained as empty as before, but there was a new smell, a slight aroma of dampness seeping from within. At night, sounds began. A soft creaking of the floor, as if someone was walking carefully on it, and almost inaudible whispers. They seemed to come from the back of the room, even though it was empty. Mark checked the lock and made sure the door was closed. But even the closed door could not drown out the eerie sound that now appeared every night. The room became the center of their attention. It seemed to have a will of its own, gradually forcing Mark to return to it again and again. The lingering cold coming from the door seemed to penetrate the house itself. The room became the center of the whole house, and for Mark it gradually turned into something more than just a part of the home. His behavior began to change. He became more and more silent, often leaving lunch or dinner to return to the room. At first, these were only short visits, during which he would just stand in the center of the room, staring at the walls. Over time, he began to spend hours there, sitting on the floor in the dark. Mark became indifferent to the usual things. Work, friends, even Alice no longer interested him. He spoke less and less, and when Alice tried to ask him about the room, he either remained silent or gave a one-word answer. A strange glint appeared in his eyes, and his face became pale, as if he was always in the shadows. One day, while passing by the room, Alice noticed that the door was open. Looking inside, she was frozen with fear. Mark was sitting on the floor, surrounded by what looked like shadows that seemed to move. He was whispering something, but the words were unintelligible. When she tried to enter, she was overcome by a feeling of cold, so strong that it felt like frost was penetrating her skin. After this incident, Mark began to behave even stranger. He no longer slept in the bedroom, but spent his nights in the room. Alice woke up several times to sounds like creaks and whispers coming from there. When she looked into the room, she saw Mark standing in the center, staring into the darkness. Sometimes he would speak softly, as if he were talking to someone invisible. Mark's condition was deteriorating. His face became thin, his eyes sunken deeply. Strange things began to happen in the house. Scratches appeared on the walls as if left by sharp claws, and the air smelled of dampness and something rotting. One day, Alice noticed strange footprints on the floor outside the room, like bare feet, but they were too big to be human. Alice tried to get Mark out of the room, but every time she tried, he became aggressive. Once, he grabbed her arm so hard that he left bruises, and the coldness of his touch made her shudder. "Don't touch her," he whispered, and her heart sank. She didn't know who he was talking to. In her dreams, Alice began to see this room. She was sleeping in the eerie darkness, and the shadows that lined the walls seemed to be reaching out to her. Every time she woke up with the feeling that someone was standing next to her bed, but the room was always empty. Mark was gradually changing into someone else. His voice became deeper, his movements slower, and his eyes looked as if someone else's was hiding behind them. The room didn't just exist. It lived, fed on the fear and despair that reigned in the house. The shadows on its walls grew thicker and thicker, and at night, dull thuds came from it, as if someone was trying to get out. One day, Alice ventured into the room. She felt that this was her last chance to save Mark. But when she crossed the threshold, the door closed behind her. Cold, thick, and piercing enveloped her. The shadows came to life, merging into a single figure standing in the center of the room. It was not a person. Its outline was indistinct, and its eyes glowed with a pale light that chilled to the bone. "He is mine," the creature growled in a voice that sounded like 100 whispers. Alice screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the shadows rushing toward her. She managed to escape the room, leaving the door open. She never found Mark again. The room remained locked, but every night she heard whispers and footsteps coming from it, as if someone was still waiting. Alice knew that the room did not let go of those it chose. Alice could no longer stand by. She realized that Mark was finally disappearing, becoming part of this room, part of something sinister that she could not comprehend. Her nights were filled with nightmares in which the room haunted her even when she was outside the house. The shadows she saw in her dreams seemed more and more real. In one of the cabinets in the kitchen, Alice found an old gasoline can with gasoline residue. She didn't know how the gasoline had gotten into the house, but she decided to use it. She planned to burn the room down once and for all, to destroy it along with the evil it harbored. Her hands trembled as she poured the gasoline across the floor, trying not to look at the shadows that already seemed alive. She could hear their whispers, feel their eyes, but she continued. Just as she finished, a sound came from behind her. She turned around and saw Mark. His eyes were empty, his face pale, and his body looked exhausted. But it wasn't Mark anymore. The man she had once known was swallowed up in this room. He took a step toward her, but his movements were unnatural, as if someone was controlling him like a puppet. "What are you doing?" His voice was both deaf and alien. Alice did not answer. She lit a match and threw it to the floor. The flame burst into flames instantly, engulfing the room and everything in it. But instead of stepping back, Mark walked into the flames. His body did not burn, and the shadows around him began to merge into a single form, creating a huge figure that looked almost inhuman. The flames crackled, but did not harm the creature that now stood before Alice. She felt panic grip her. The house began to shake, the walls cracked, and the floor vibrated as if the building itself was trying to break free of its foundation. Alice ran out of the room, trying to escape, but the corridors seemed longer than before, and the doors leading to the exit were locked. She found a hammer in the closet and started pounding on the front door. Behind her, she could hear heavy footsteps and whispers that grew louder. Eventually the door gave way, and she ran outside, out of breath and shaking. The house was in darkness, but she could still see the light of the fire inside. Alice looked around and saw the shadows moving toward the windows, but they were no longer approaching. The house was quiet, as if waiting. She didn't know if she had destroyed the evil or if she had just awakened it even more. Alice left the house forever, but in her dreams it haunted her. The flames, the shadows, and Mark's empty gaze stayed with her forever. Alice left the house and decided never to return. She moved as far away as possible, hoping to leave everything behind: the room, the shadows, and even the memory of Mark. But there was no peace. Everywhere she went, She heard whispers in her head. At first it was quiet and blurry, like an echo, but then it became clearer. She heard it in her dreams, in quiet moments, even in the midst of the din of the crowd. "He's mine," the whisper repeated over and over again. A few weeks later, she stayed in a small motel where she finally decided to go through her phone. She had saved photos of the house and even a few voice recorder recordings made in an attempt to capture the sounds from the room. Opening one of the files, Alice heard not just a whisper, but Mark's voice. He was calling her name, but his words were distorted, as if they were being repeated by other voices. That night she woke up with a strange sensation. The motel room was cold, even though the radiator was running at full blast. She turned around and saw a thin shadow on the wall that could not belong to any object in the room. The shadow moved, and she thought she saw the familiar outline of Mark's face. She screamed and turned on the light, but the shadow disappeared. The next day, she decided to return to the house. It seemed to her that this was the only way to stop this nightmare, even if it meant facing whatever was living in the room. When she arrived, the house looked the same as it did the day she fled. The windows were dark, and the door was barely hanging open after her last attempt to get out. Alice went inside. The air was heavy, and the smell of dampness was even stronger. She walked down the corridor, avoiding the remains of the furniture, and came to the door of the room. It was open. Inside, she saw what was left of Mark. His silhouette, now entirely made up of shadows, moving silently around the room. She realized that the room didn't just exist. It was alive, and its purpose was to consume. Mark was just another victim, and now she was going to be the next. The room began to pull her in like a magnet. Shadows rose from the floor and walls, wrapping around her legs. She could feel the cold penetrating her bones, but at the same time something inside her exploded. She shouted Mark's name, hoping to reach whoever was left in this darkness. For a moment, the shadows stopped and then retreated. She saw Mark's silhouette freeze, his eyes, now nothing but empty holes, staring straight at her. "Go," she heard him say, his voice faint and distant. It was the only moment he broke through the darkness. Alice rushed to the door and ran out of the house without even looking back. When she was outside, the house began to shake as if in agony. The windows exploded and the walls collapsed. Alice saw the house swallowing itself up and realized it was the end. But was it really the end? A few months later, Alice moved to a new city. She hoped to start a new life, but every night when she fell asleep, a familiar shadow appeared in the darkness. She wasn't sure if it was just her fears or if the house had left a part of itself inside her. Shadows never disappear, and she knew that for sure.